Welcome back to the Blues Notebook, episode 3. I'm once again joined by John Coleman, and this week we'll be picking apart the 3-0 win over Derby County's under-21s, what Rob Elliot had to say ahead of his first competitive Carlisle United fixture, and we will be going through the 24 sides in the National League, grouping them into title chasers, playoff contenders, mid-table and strugglers. So John, the first port of call is the final pre-season game at Derby's training ground. Before we get into the match, what was the experience like?
Well, it was a pretty impressive complex, as you can imagine, of a club of that size. You know, Derby County, a club with aspirations to get back into and establish themselves in the Premier League, and Moor Farm had so many pitches. I was losing count of how many pitches they have up there, and not just football pitches, but other facilities, office buildings. You can imagine all the fitness things that they have going on there, community stuff, no doubt. So, yeah, a pretty vast kind of complex, really, that obviously dwarfs anything you see at our sort of level. And yeah, I suppose glad and grateful that Derby allowed us to go and attend and watch the game, because it wasn't open to supporters. Some clubs get very sort of defensive about letting any kind of independent pair of eyes on anything that goes on in these places, almost to a fault, really. So I was glad that Derby's media team had no problem with that, and Carlisle United's media guys were as helpful as could be as regards that as well. So it meant we could go and have a look and have a presence at the thing, and be able to watch the game and sort of draw the conclusions that we can. So it was good to be able to do that. It was a boiling hot sunny day as well. We were kind of staring into the sun quite a lot from this table that we got rigged up at the side of the pitch, but much better to see it than not, and much better to be there than not, I would say.
Well, you were the only one of the two of us that were there. What stood out to you from the performance of Carlisle? Obviously, it's the last game they've got before the season starts against Worthing. Was there any clues as to maybe who's going to start the season for the Blues?
I think there were some pretty clear clues, actually, and those clues were in sort of who didn't start the game initially. I think Rob Elliot certainly used the first half to give minutes to a number of players that maybe hadn't had too many, or were maybe more on the fringes of things. One or two younger players too, one or two who were coming back into sort of availability, like Josh Williams and Junior Luamba, etc. Stephen Wern, who've come back from little injuries and things. So in the main, I suspect the first half 11 wouldn't have contained very many starters at all that we'll expect to see on Saturday. Now, Archie Mayer in goal might be a different matter. We'll perhaps come on to that later. Many of them, or what you would call established names, expected starters, were there, and the majority of those came on in the second half. And that coincided with the game sort of turning pretty firmly in Carlisle's favour when they had a more established first team on the pitch, and people like Linney, Aziz, Kelly Bunker, etc. were operating to pretty good effect. And how worthwhile it is as an exercise against the kind of opposition they're just not going to face in the league, it's probably limited. But just in terms of, I guess, getting further players up to speed, working on a few patterns, etc., as they did particularly in the second half, and blooding some younger players too. These things are all useful, I think, and perhaps strengthening maybe a connection with Derby as well, which is something Rob Elliot has done in previous jobs as regards loan players, etc. So I think you can always derive something positive from these games. As a dress rehearsal for Worthing, maybe less so, but that there are other things that managers will draw from friendlies, and they go beyond just that sort of finite thing, I would say.
I think there was one shock, certainly for me, on the team sheet, was to see another trialist, but it wasn't someone from outside the club, was it?
No, it wasn't. It was Lewis Story again, trialist A, as he's been sort of referred to on team sheets throughout this summer, actually. Yeah, because that was my first intrigue when I turned up and the club published the team sheet. Trialist in the team, you immediately start looking and scanning. There was no unfamiliar faces there whatsoever. Lewis Story was there with his kit on, warming up with the others, and he played. So, I mean, Rob Elliot has said it from an early stage in pre-season that Lewis Story wasn't really going to be an option he was going to look at when the real stuff starts, unless it was a kind of an emergency situation. So, again, there's no word that he's been sort of registered as a player at this point. That'll be why he's down as a trialist. So we don't expect to see him on the team sheet on Saturday, with Carlisle having kind of reinforced that injury hit defence with the likes of Malarkey, etc. And they have other options. So yeah, trialist A, Louis Story might sort of remain that way, I suppose, unless the crisis deepens at the back, I guess.
Obviously, Carlisle scored 3. I think you have to take it with a grain of salt, especially against an under-21 side. No disrespect to the young players, obviously, it's great experience for both sides. Did Carlisle look like they had their shooting boots on more so than against Salford?
In that sort of second half spell, yes. It was good. It's good to see Regan Linney going through and scoring with ease and sort of a clinical finish. I don't suppose it matters to someone who's hoping to score a heck of a lot of goals in the coming season. I don't suppose it matters where they come in pre-season when you're trying to get your eye in and you're trying to get in that groove. So he took his goal clinically. It was good to see Stephen Wern get one. I think that's an area where I think some supporters have kind of pinpointed as something he needs to do more of, just in terms of numbers, goals, assists, etc. for everything he brought more broadly to that attacking midfield area last season. So good to see him sort of clicking back into that, and Harvey Bunker picked up what was a bit of a tap in from a pretty well worked second phase from a set piece. So again, you can't read too much in, as you say. There is a pinch of salt with a lot of the sort of outcome of something like that, but certainly better to see Carlisle on the front foot and doing those things than coming up short in a game like that, which would raise some pretty troubling questions, and we certainly didn't get into that territory, thankfully.
I think one of the big questions that fans are still debating, especially from what I've heard and what I've read from fans, is what type of formation, what type of style of play Rob Elliot will be leaning towards. I know people are questioning about the 3/5 at the back with the flying wing backs, or if it's going to be a flat back 4. I suspect there's going to be a bit of both. I think it'll depend on the opposition. But what did you see at Derby? Was it a 3 or was it a 4?
I think essentially we're going to see something quite fluid when it comes to that, and I don't think those numbers are necessarily always going to be perhaps as rigid as they might be maybe under other managers at other times. It appears that it's ostensibly a 4, but certainly on the right. I mean, Leo Duro came on in the second half. It was Josh Williams in the first half. Those are two very attack-minded fullbacks, stroke wing-backs. There seems to be an accent on certainly that particular player being very attacking, and that seems to then leave the defensive framework perhaps more as a 3, while someone like Duro is bombing on and really joining that attacking set. I suspect there'll be times too when further players are fit, you may have Harvey Bunker as the defensive sort of anchor in midfield, but he's got clearly the capability to then drop back. At the moment, he's sort of playing in that central defensive unit, and that may be how Carlisle begin because of those absentees. So that seems the broad picture, it looks like. And then I suppose it's the arrangement of that midfield too, because in what has been probably a more first choice kind of pick with what he's had this summer, we've had someone like Cameron Harper tried out in that sitting midfield. Then you've had the likes of Aziz a bit more up and down, and people like Callum Whelan too in a slightly more attacking deployment as well. And that was Wern on Saturday too, and we know he's a more attack-minded midfielder clearly. So beyond that, it's probably how the attack, the forefront of the attack is arranged. Looks like it's going to be Kelly in the number 9, Linney in the number 10 in a sort of roaming freer role, and then does it come down to Adjiboy on the left more than the right? It looks like it's going to be that way too. So I think there'll be a bit of adaptability in quite a few of those areas actually, but I think the framework from what we've just discussed is looking reasonably clear at this point.
Yeah, well, moving on from Derby, it was more, in my opinion, an exercise just to get minutes in the legs, fine-tune everything ready for the weekend. As we're recording on Wednesday, you spoke to Rob Elliot and Callum Whelan ahead of the game. Is there any notable lines that you'd like to pick out from Rob Elliot ahead of the coverage in the News and Star in the coming days?
Yeah, one or two obvious sort of top lines, I think, on the injury front. There was some pretty encouraging news in the availability of, for one, David Adjiboy. Elliot said he's sort of trained in a kind of a non-contact kind of way initially. He called him a floater in training as he's dipped back in after that back injury, but he expects that to build up in anticipation of the weekend. He's been quite consistent with his line that he expects Adjaboy to be fit, which would be an obvious plus. Gabe Breeze as well is someone that's coming back into training now after that knee injury. And again, that will be sort of assessed as to how he comes through that on Friday, I think, when they're back in next before the weekend. Now, the question there comes down to is he going to consider putting Breeze straight in for that first game, having had this injury and having, I guess, in the meantime, allowed Archie Mayer to kind of bed into that side for a couple of games. My suspicion is that Mayer might just be the man in possession given those circumstances at the moment, but we know that Breeze was the established number one last season, and if fit, he's clearly going to be a strong contender for that. So that's an interesting call. As I say, that my leaning is maybe that it might go to Mayer, certainly to start. Then it might change as things go on and Breeze gets further up to speed, which I don't think will take very long. Beyond that, Brad Nicholson and Kenton Richardson look like they're going to be fit, certainly for the squad. From what Elliot was saying, I think that their lack of football in the last 2 or 3 weeks will probably preclude them from starting, but it looks like they could be in the mix, and one, if not both, maybe on the bench, I would say.
Yeah.
On the fitness front, that seems to be it in terms of who might come off the recent treatment table and back into things on Saturday. McAdam's not too far away, he said. I asked if the Oval game would be a potential. He didn't sort of pin his colours to that mast as such, but McAdam isn't too far away, I think, in general. Then you've got the likes of Feeney and Armstrong, etc., coming a little bit further down the line and not too far away. So that was quite positive news, I suppose. It still means Carlisle are going to be starting the season light in terms of some of those frontline options that we know about, but a little bit more of the depth maybe there on the team sheet. Beyond that, one or two of the obvious topics were is anything going to happen transfer-wise before the start of the season? Elliot, when I spoke to him at Derby, said it'll kind of be only if we're forced into it, really, if our hands are going to be forced, depending on the injury situation. I think he was referring to how quickly Gabe Breeze might recover there. That seems to be happening, so I wouldn't really expect anything on the goalkeeping front unless someone comes in and bids a significant amount for Breeze before Saturday and takes him away. Again, don't think that's going to happen in the short term. And other than that, it's the centre-forward situation. Now, that seems to be the one that's still standing out to a lot of people as something that looks certainly a player light. Elliot's answer was along the lines of that, yeah, it is the obvious area to look at, but his words were, we're not necessarily going aggressively after something at the moment. It's one we're kind of going to continue to monitor in terms of what we have and who's coming back and when they're going to be back. He sees Junior Lawamba as a potential option there. I guess whether that's going to be successful or not remains to be seen. He tried him there at Derby in that first half. And you've got Kelly and Linney already there. And I guess in the wings, you've got a youngster like Seb Mason, who probably isn't ready for that sort of frontline involvement, I would think. So it seems pretty obvious that there's a potential gap there, even if it's just to supplement what they have in the longer term. Maybe it's from the younger end of the market, maybe. I don't know. The implication seemed to be that they might not be rushing to do anything before Saturday. Now, as we all know, things can always change in football at the drop of a hat and at a phone call, or someone pulls up in training. So you'd like to think they're at the very least poised to do something if they really feel they need it. The vibes were that it may not be before Saturday. He suggested that they weren't really looking at anyone else on the trialist front, etc. Now, by all accounts, there has been a different face on the training pitch this week. That's certainly not been referred to by the club, and he certainly hasn't been named by the club. But apparently there is someone there now. How serious a contender that is for a potential move, we really don't know at the moment. That's something that will hopefully get fleshed out over time. And beyond that, Elliot was speaking quite complimentary about Worthing as a footballing side, not to underestimate them, even though they've come up from the 6th tier. I think we saw enough evidence of that last season when Boreham Wood came up and when Scunthorpe came up, that you underestimate sides with a winning habit, with a winning kind of ethic at your peril, really. So he was complimentary and sort of praising of Worthing to a fault, really, Elliot, today. So again, it's much better to flatter the opposition than to give them something that can put on the dressing room wall, isn't it, as well? So there was certainly nothing that would agitate Adam Hinchelwood and his side in what Elliot said. So, yeah, it's there's some good anticipation down there. I sense there was a quite a positive and optimistic bearing around Elliot, which you would expect, you would hope for. It would be wrong if it wasn't. And soon the talking's going to be over, isn't it?
I think that's definitely a point that I think personally I'd like to emphasize as well. The winning momentum carries you so far in football, and it can go the other way as well. Carlisle are the case in point of that. The back-to-back relegations, I believe, could be partly put down to the loser mindset of just losing games week in, week out. And like we saw with Boreham Wood last season, if you're used to winning, you've got a core group stuck together that have that winning mentality. They can go on and push on. It's not unheard of in this league that newly promoted teams can be up there. I think that's something that Mark Hughes definitely did right. He got that winning mentality back into the squad. You can see that with the record points haul he got last season. And I think that's definitely going to be something that the squad, considering we have kept a good core, I think that winning mentality, although the disappointment of the playoffs, it will definitely help carry the squad to hopefully challenge for the league.
You would like to think so, and you'd like to think we will ultimately look back at the Mark Hughes tenure as the sort of rebuilding of those foundations. As you say, that negative momentum that Carlisle carried down from League One to the National League, it was pretty vertical, wasn't it? And that was always going to take a bit of pretty serious short-term work to address that. Mark Hughes certainly stopped Carlisle losing in pretty bold terms, and yes, you may well argue that so he should have done at this sort of level. Correct, but changing course maybe isn't always as easy as we sometimes like to think. So that ship was certainly steadied. And it should put Carlisle into a position now to build and add those bits on which that they're hoping they've done this summer, and that they're trying to enhance a team that is largely accustomed to winning again, and it's something that they can grow. Now, just to touch on the point about teams coming up with that winning mentality, we did see that with Boreham Wood and with Scunthorpe last season. Didn't necessarily get it from Truro, did we either? So there are still cases where perhaps the new level can still be maybe something of a culture shock. Maybe it's a bridge too far for some. We'll see which side of that kind of coin Worthing are on Saturday, won't we, as opponents?
Well, we can move on to Worthing. I think it's a good test for the first game of the season. It's one you'd expect Carlisle. I wouldn't say you'd expect them to win, but you're hopeful that they'll win, especially with a newly promoted side. But I feel Worthing they were very good last season, and also with Adam Hinchelwood, he knows the league. I know some may say unfairly sacked from York, but then they did walk the league after he went. So I don't know. It's a tough first game, and I think it's definitely going to show what the squad are like. But like we say, it's light. The first game of the season can be a bit slow. The team isn't in the flow yet. What are your first thoughts on the Worthing fixture?
Yeah, I think Worthing are a very interesting first test, actually, partly because of that Hinchelwood factor, and partly because of how his teams play. I think in the National League, and we saw this last season quite a lot, there are a lot more teams now that do look to play more football, more along that possession style, and there were quite a few that tried it without very impressive results, and Carlisle leapt on that under Mark Hughes, and they punished teams that just weren't well enough honed in that style of play. Carlisle pressed, jumped on it, and there were games where there were 2 or 3 up at half time and it was game over. So done badly, it can be a hindrance to teams, I suppose. Done well, and that's essentially how the better sides in the division played last season at the high end, York, Rochdale, and certainly, as we saw, took Carlisle's cost, Boreham Wood. I suspect Worthing may be on the better side of that kind of 50-50, if you like, just because of who the manager is, how they've grown last season. That they've been growing at that level below for a little while now. So they are a club on the rise, and in terms of what they've done in the summer since they've came up, they don't seem to have sort of suffered a glut of real heavy departures in terms of the better players, which can sometimes happen. Sometimes teams can get players cherry picked when they come up, and that's cost teams before going up at different levels. But they don't seem to have been hit hard by that. They've made one or two sort of pretty interesting additions, I would say. We might come on to that when we look at the division as a whole, but I imagine there'll be a side who are fairly clear in their identity. I would think they're not a side that's maybe not certain of that and sort of mid rebuild or anything like that. I think there are perhaps sides that maybe Carlisle would have preferred to play, just in terms of those that are maybe right at the outset of trying to find a new way. I think Worthing will have that already. That'll make them problematic opponents in some ways, but at the same time, and without being complacent about this, Carlisle have to look at Worthing at home on the first day as a game they should be winning. And again, that's with every respect to the visitors. This is Carlisle United, who are targeting the title at the National League, having come off a 95-point season. Doesn't always work out that way. I remember going back to Carlisle's first season at this level in 2004-05, when Paul Simpson was in charge, and he was in the process of that remarkable revival he did at that time. And Canvey Island were the visitors on the opening day. Now, that seemed a bit Goliath against David. Yet Carlisle just couldn't find a way to goal for all their strengths, and it ended up being a 0-0 that the visitors were, I'm sure, more than chuffed with. So nothing's a given, nothing's certain, and Carlisle, we're waiting to see what will take effect in the Rob Elliot way, and what he's been able to add, what he's short of at the moment. So there are some uncertainties about the whole thing, but you'd like to think Carlisle's overall strength will be telling.
Well, Worthing have had 4 wins and 3 defeats in pre-season. And in a very handy look at the rivals that John put together, he earmarked Dom Hutchinson as a danger man, the new summer signing who Carlisle obviously have experience against from Wealdstone. Do you feel like he could trouble Carlisle's defence, especially with the frailties that they've got at the moment with the injuries?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, he scored some goals in pre-season. He's got 3 or 4 goals. So it looks like he might emerge as an early key player for them. I mean, look, Carlisle will be tested at some point in the game on Saturday. You're tested in most games one way or the other. And they'll have other threats, no doubt, as well as their general sort of style. But you like to think Carlisle's strengths should overpower their strengths. Carlisle have Regan Linney to throw at them, and the various other qualities that they're hoping to put together. David Adjiboy, who's an ex-Worthing player, actually, has played under Adam Hinshelwood in the Academy of Brighton, and at York later, at Worthing, in between as well. So, and he is an attacking player that I'm sure the majority of National League teams would want in form too. So, whilst being mindful of people Worthing can throw at Carlisle, Carlisle should have much more to throw at Worthing individually. The question is, does the whole package work, and does it all click together? That to me is the crux of how Carlisle are going to hopefully move on this season. It's whether the system, the style, the ethic that Elliot brings, and the coaching that he sort of imparts is going to bring these individuals together, and we'll get the first sight of that properly on Saturday, won't we?
Yeah, and it does seem like a question that has an easy answer, but how important is that first win for Rob Elliott's side? Even if it's not perfect, just 3 points on the board, show they can. It's a phrase that people are using quite often now in football, but if it comes to it, show that they can ride difficult periods in a game and escape with 3 points, or put on an absolute outstanding performance, put 4 past them. I think Carlisle really need to start well with 3 points. The performance it can be there, it can not be there, but as long as they get the 3 points, I think that's just completely vital. And it goes without saying, really.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, it might be wrong to expect Carlisle to be at their absolute slickest and all the parts working and absolutely purring on day one, given what has changed this summer in terms of the change of head coach, in terms of the difference in style he's looking to bring in terms of 1 or 2 of the additions they've made too. So maybe it'd be naive to think that they'll have reached sort of their 100% peak come the first game in terms of all of that. But I think it's important that they start well. I think first impressions are important when it's a new head coach, and Carlisle have gone down a certain route this summer. We know they're not spending the money that they have been in the past as well. They're trying to do things a different way. I think people will be looking for some vindication of that. And I think clearly, because of how the National League was last season and how it's been in certain other seasons, you can't afford too much slack in your results from day one. I mean, York drew a few games early on last season, and that cost Hinchelwood in the end, didn't it, ultimately? They didn't lose many, though, and they were pretty soon gathering up the wins. Their lull, such as it was, didn't amount to more than a couple of games, and that's how ruthless you have to look to be. And so with that in mind, it's as important for that reason that Carlisle win on Saturday. It's not a disaster if they don't, clearly, and we probably shouldn't leap off the cliff with our judgments if it doesn't go quite to plan. But at the same time, you can't be stumbling along for very long at all if you're wanting to win a National League where there's one automatic promotion place, and you might need to chalk up 100 points plus to do that. So for various reasons, we want a good start. We want to see a good start on Saturday, and that to then develop into a good start over a period, as you've mentioned before as well, and others have, before you get to that late August, early September period where suddenly you're hit by a number of what might be your main rivals. So we want Carlisle to be in good enough order by then, at the very least, and that means plenty of points on the board.
Yeah, and personally, I remember when Hinchelwood was let go from York, and I remember saying it was harsh, but then obviously the ruthlessness, well, the proof's in the pudding. They're now in League Two, so I feel like it's not a disaster if you don't win, but if you don't win, you very quickly have to correct that and get yourself back on the right path. Because as last season showed, the two teams they were steamrolling the league. Like we mentioned earlier, I don't think they went more than one game in a row without winning. If it was a draw. They weren't losing, and I think it would be tough for any team to recreate what York and Rochdale did last season. But it's something that Carlisle should be aiming for, especially with the players in the team. You've got Regan Linney, you've got Morgan Feeney, now Miguel Aziz in there. And I must have a Miguel Aziz fan club card somewhere. But players like that, they are the top of this division, and they're the elite players at this level. And I feel like you can hang your hat on them to perform, but like you said, the system's got to work around them too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that remains to be seen. It doesn't remain to be seen with people like Feeney, who we know, was in the team of the season, and he's clearly a top central defender and captain at this level. Regan Linney's records hopefully indicates that we'll get a bit more of the same next season. Aziz stepping up from Morecambe. We hope he's going to be the impactful midfielder that we like to think he is, and certainly in a lot of his traits that we've had glimpses of, you can certainly see the potential for that. And I think really looking forward to watching him. I think he's going to be a very watchable player, easy on the eye, I think, when he's on song. And I hope he's on song certainly more often than not, because then we really will have a player on our hands. It was interesting talking about the demanding nature of what a title race at this level can be with Rob Elliot today. I was asking him, do you have a sort of points total in mind? He sort of suggested that, if Carlisle can emulate what they did last year, maybe just, tot one or two more onto that. That might be what they're looking at. And his sort of rationale for that was he thinks that the lower end of the National League will be better than it was last year. He thinks it'll be more competitive. Teams at the bottom will generally accrue more points. By consequence, that will probably take more points off teams at the higher end. And it might be a bit tighter. There might not be quite a spread from top to bottom in terms of numbers. So it might not take, 110 points or whatever to actually win the thing. But I think from the outset, you have to set your sights on being as ruthless and as merciless as possible. In case that does develop again, who knows? Another side may turn into what we saw last season. I don't quite see it initially as another York and Rochdale necessarily, looking at things on paper, but you can't take that for granted. It might happen. Someone might emerge that you don't quite expect. And there'll be a title race of some sort. So you've got to be flexing your muscles as much as you can in it. And not having runs of a couple of defeats and, you know, maybe one win in 4 and stuff, things like that that cost Carlisle in the end, even though they were racking up the points generally. So it goes back to the point that a good ruthless start set the tone, and then you know, you've got to manage each sort of phase of a long season after that.
Yeah, and I don't think I've seen many people with that mindset, but I think it would be naive to think we can turn up, beat everyone, and then go up now that York and Rochdale have left the division. I think it opens up a lot more, and especially we'll come on to it, but teams like Boston recruiting really well. The mid-table to lower last season, they recruited well. I think they'll cause more trouble than what they did last year. But then you've got fixtures last year that Carlisle should have put teams to the sword. I know it was early on, and I did mention it, I think, last week, but Boreham Wood, that should have been a win at home early on. I don't think they should have conceded that 2 to make it 3-3. I also think comes to mind Yeovil away as well. They struggled there. There is
Solihull Moors away when they turn it round 3-2 into injury time and a sloppy goal against Woking at home where they were turned over 3-1. They were games that cost them the chance to stay in that race, and those were games that Rochdale and York weren't dropping points in, even when there was a risk of that. And that's the point you're making. I know, and there are one or two others too. And this is how good you have to be. You just can't have any sort of give in your form. And even if it doesn't take quite as many points as that this season, you can't be dropping off that too much, because I think the averages over the last 10-15 years show what Carlisle got last season would have won the league on occasions, but it wouldn't have won the league all the time, and necessarily even a majority of the time. So they have to be looking to improve on numbers as well as everything else, definitely.
Yeah, and one that really sticks out in my mind as well was the 1-1 draw with Eastleigh at home, especially with that bumper crowd. I think that was a one that you really think they've missed on a chance here. That was I think that was around the time where Carlisle were top of the league as well. There's just fixtures and games where you think they could have done more, or they could have held on to a lead. But before we get into our predictions and grouping the National League, is there any opening day fixtures that stand out to you as the best and the worst for Carlisle?
Yeah, there's a few actually that do spring to mind. I mean, if you're talking about the best opening days in Carlisle United's history, and you're not immediately going to 1974, then you're looking in the wrong place, really. A debut as a top flight team, getting a guard of honour at Stamford Bridge, and then going out there and winning your first game at that level, 2-0, Bill Green, Les O'Neill, and that historic and great team, making its mark, in front of the match of the day cameras, and all of that sort of thing. That's unsurpassable, really, isn't it, for an opening day memory? More recent years, I don't think there's been too many that really resonate greatly. I mean, just off the top of my head of recent times, that there was, last season was a good solid away win at Woking, but it wouldn't go into the annals of resounding lifelong memories, probably, would it? They started the 22-23 promotion season against Crawley with a good ground out 1-0 win. Again, it wasn't spectacular stuff. I think you have to go back into history for some of the ones that truly stand out. I mean, I'm going quite a long way back here, but when Carlisle got up to the second division for the very first time in 1965, it was on the back of a double promotion, and then their first game at that level, Norwich City came to town, and Carlisle gave them a good spanking 4-1 with the likes of Chris Balderstone newly into the team and things like that. That strikes me as something that really jumps out of the history books as what an opening day that must have been. What exciting times those must have been for the club, in uncharted territory. The record opening day win goes back a bit further to 1953 when Rochdale were put away 7-0. So, let's try and equal that if we can on Saturday.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, and other ones, 1982 when they'd just gone up from the third tier to the second and went to Derby and won 3-0 with Mally Poskett and Alan Shoulder making merry there. So those I would say maybe ones you cherry pick. One of my favourites was 2006 when Carlisle had just gone up from League Two and Paul Murray got the winner against Doncaster on the opening day. It was quite an emotional goal for Paul Murray, who was coming back to the club for a second time, a Cumbrian lad. It was his first and only goal at Brunton Park, I think, too. That was a memorable one. Brunton Park was rocking that day too. So whether beating Worthing on the opening day, with every respect, can join some of those ones in the history books, I suspect perhaps not, but we'll take any sort of win, won't we, just to get that first 3 points on the board. Worst ones, well, being Carlisle United, we've got a few of those too, haven't we?
Absolutely.
Stinkers. 2013 opening day against Leyton Orient in League One, and you think everything you do over the summer, the signings you make, the sort of the fresh things you try to add, all the coaching you do, and then on day one your star striker gets sent off in Lee Miller, and you get beat 5-1 at home. If ever there's a tone that gets set in a negative way, it's that one, isn't it? That was a pretty bitter and sorry afternoon that really kind of lit the way the Carlisle were going that season towards relegation. 2003, when they played York on the opening day, springs to mind too. It wasn't a heavy defeat. It was a 2-1 defeat, but it was it had all the hallmarks of the declining time of Roddy Collins, where his star summer signing, Steve Livingston, was sent off for fighting in the first half with one of the York players too, and it just had that stamp of chaos which you don't want at the start of a season. And again, within a few weeks, Collins was gone. That had unravelled, and it heralded the start of the Paul Simpson sort of first saviour act. So things like that come to mind. They've lost 5-1 twice on the opening day of a season. There's a record equalled by the 1936-37 team there. And one more before we hopefully move on to slightly more cheerful stuff that really sticks out in my memory. It would be the 2020-21 season. Now that actually started with a couple of cup games. It was in the belated COVID lockout season, but the league season started. I think it was the third game when Carlisle went down to Cambridge under Chris Beach. Got beat 3-0, well and truly beaten. It wasn't just the defeat and how kind of poorly they played. It was just the total lack of opening day atmosphere down there. It was behind closed doors. It was just that false feeling that accompanied so much of that season. And yes, while we were all glad that football in some form was going on, it was just that eerie nature of it that just added to the kind of desolate feeling of watching that unfold. And that's not something any of us would like to repeat, I'm sure. So I think we should probably park the misery there before we reach something strong to drink, and we'll move on to slightly better stuff now, eh?
And I think a lot of fans will remember that COVID season for the dawn of the dreaded EFL I follow. Brilliant. But to be fair, it could be argued it's better than DAZN. I don't know. Probably wouldn't disagree with that. I've got one last sort of piece of trivia to throw in before we move on. Carlisle on Saturday will be looking to win their first game of the season for the second consecutive year. When was the last time Carlisle actually did that in 2 consecutive seasons? I'll leave that one with you. I'll leave that with our viewers and our listeners as well. I mean, eagle-eyed readers of the News and Star will know that. I'm sure people that are kind of sort of a bit nerdish on the history might know that, but we'll come to that one in the end. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go through the 24 teams in the National League. We're not going to go position by position. We'll group them into 4 categories: strugglers, mid-table, playoff contenders, and then title chasers. We're going to start with strugglers. I'll run through my list of strugglers first, John, and then you can follow, and then we'll break down some of the teams we think will particularly struggle. So first, I've got Hornchurch. They've got the least experience. I also think the summer transfers have not been brilliant. And then followed by Wealdstone, Tamworth, Sutton, Altrincham, Aldershot, and then Kidderminster, especially due to Adam Murray going to Barrow.
Right, that's interesting. That we're in a bit of disagreement already, which is always good, isn't it? Not on all of them. I've got Hornchurch in there. I slightly disagree as regards the recruitment on paper. I don't think it's been too bad. I think they've brought in 1 or 2 fairly solid-looking, quite experienced EFL players. Joe Kizzy, ex-Sutton, Tom Dallas and Jack Powell from Crewe, Innes from Forest Green. So those just strike me as players that might help them sort of tool up to acclimatise at this kind of level. They're going to be the least fancied of all sides, I think, Hornchurch, aren't they? That might work in their favour. Their ground isn't going to be one that's sort of going to appeal to a lot of people to go and visit and play at necessarily.
No, another race
so
track.
Yeah, but they might, whatever Hornchurch can use in their favour to be perhaps, create a bit of nuisance value at this level, they might well have to use. Anton Ferdinand's gone in as a coach as well. That's a really interesting, one of the more interesting off-field moves we've seen in the league this summer. And again, we talked about Worthing before. Hornchurch have got a winning way as well. Boreham Wood came up through the playoffs last year. It's Hornchurch this time. They've got Angelo Balanta, ex-Carlisle, who was the player of the year at that level last season, still getting goals. He's in a sort of more advancing years, I suppose, in terms of his career, but quite a wily operator, I'm quite sure still. So you'd expect they'll lose quite a lot of games. Yeah. But I'm not sure they'll flounder in the way that some might predict. So that's my view on Hornchurch. I still think they'll be in the struggler category. Aldershot, I agree with. Mm-hmm. They've had an enormous turnover of players, haven't they? I think their owner talked back end of last season about the budget having to come down quite significantly. The change manager with John Coleman going out, Scott Davis coming in. They weren't that far above the drop zone last season at all. And a couple of those signings look like they might sort of carry them a little bit, like Dinanga from Bromley. But in the main, there's a lot from National League South and similar levels. It comes down to sort of making something cohesive out of so much change and so much newness in terms of bodies. It might be a lot of change to stay the same or get worse, I fear, for Aldershot there. One or two others I've got. I mean, look, I think there's some that could go either or. But Eastleigh look to me like a side who have got one or two issues. I know Matt Gray, the manager, has been quite critical of where they've been at in pre-season. They were quite underwhelming last season, I think, under different managers. They've lost one or two players. They've brought one or two in, likes of Hawkins from Barnet. If he can produce what he's done in years gone by, he might give them a bit of backbone, I suppose. But they look like a side that could struggle. And I think Gray's know-how at this level, he took Sutton up from this level. He did a fine job there. A few years on now, he perhaps might give them hope that he can find a way to lift them again.
Yeah,
but I think looking at the general picture, it might be a surprise if they do much more than struggle, to be honest.
I think that's what I hung my hat on with Eastleigh, just the experience at the level. I feel like that is definitely something that will play a part. But as you said, the winning mentality with Hornchurch could also, like we've mentioned, affect it.
Yeah, quite possibly. Gateshead, and this, I think, applies to a heck of a lot of teams at the higher, middle or lower end of the National League. That there's a lot of questions unanswered at this point. And with Gateshead, it's, Lee Cattermole, unknown quantity as a manager. It's how they cover the clear, large scale losses they've suffered on and off the pitch with, Rob Elliot and some of his staff coming to Carlisle, a couple of the key players coming to Carlisle. Have they brought in enough that will let them get over that and let them sort of grow somewhat from what was a real season of two halves last year? It was very desolate for the first half, and it was quite a remarkable and spirited revival after that. They've made one or two interesting additions. A lad from New Zealand, Luke Supik, I think he's called. He seems to have caught the eye a little bit in pre-season. Jack Robinson, ex-Carlisle left back's gone in there. Now he's been sort of short of football for quite a long time. So you wouldn't necessarily say that's a signing that's going to transform them into a top half playoff chasing team by any means. I think if Cattermole can get some sort of alchemy that Elliot got last season, you could see Gateshead being fine, because they're accustomed to kind of fighting against the odds, I suppose, in a way. But if it doesn't quite work, you can see them struggling again. So I've lumped them in with my strugglers. Kidderminster, I've kind of considered them in that category too. I think losing Adam Murray is a real blow. Paul Watton coming in, is he the managerial replacement that makes you think he'll keep them on the rise? Based on his CV, I'm not convinced. Maybe wrong. They've clearly got good things going there. They're a good club. They're a good club with a good name. It's good to see Kidderminster back at this level, I suppose. And they've kept a decent core from last season. They've don't seem to have added a heck of a lot. But they're a club of reasonable stature, I would say, to be coming up into the division. And I think they'll be competitive. I find it hard to think there'll be more than that. So they might have a little bit of an uphill task, I think. But and one other, I think, is very dependent on what happens next is Woking. Now, Woking, you tend to imagine them as a side that's more towards the middle and higher end, and maybe with a fair wind, having a little tilt at the playoffs. But the kind of chaotic run up to the season with Jermaine Defoe going in pretty acrimonious terms, it looks like. As we speak now, they haven't got a replacement in, that they're going in with an interim regime. So that depends on how quickly they can settle those waters, I suppose, at Woking. I don't think that they're the worst squad in the league by any means. There's one or two very good and, well, it appears from a distance, very capable players at this level. I like the defender Okoli. He was pretty impressive against Carlisle a couple of times last season. They've renewed with the likes of Odesina. Josh Kelly coming in, it looks a decent sort of capture. So they've got the potential to grow something better there at Woking, but you wonder what's gone on there in terms of the Defoe and what's the underlying factors there, and can they quickly find some more stability there managerially, and that I think is what they'll hinge on. Right now, I've got them as potential slightly surprise strugglers that could come out of that if they get the decision right, I suppose, because I feel there's a big bunch of National League teams that you could very easily say it could go either way, and I think they're one of them.
Yeah. So moving on to mid-table now. I'll list off a couple first, and then one team that I've earmarked that could probably rise higher. So I've got Eastleigh, as we've mentioned, Yeovil, Solihull Moors, Boston. I feel I've done Boston slightly harsh there. I think the recruitment's brilliant. I think they've done really, really strong recruitment, but I think they may be lacking one or two. And then Woking and Gateshead. And the only reason I've got Gateshead higher than Strugglers is because they went on that run at the end of last season, of course, with Rob Elliot, which pulled them out of basically relegation. I feel like they would have regrouped and really got that camaraderie together. I know they've lost some players, but I feel like I just don't see them being in that situation again this season. I think they'll be hovering, but I don't think they'll be that damned to relegation. And the team that I'm tipping to maybe go up into playoff contenders is Fylde. I really like them. I really like what they've done. They've spent money, and I think they can cause a lot of teams problems in this division. Yeah,
I mean, I'm a little bit like you with Fylde. I was a little borderline on mid-table or maybe playoff outsiders. I put them in my mid-table group, but yeah, I wouldn't be stunned if they went a little bit higher than that. They certainly look a little bit better equipped than the last time they were previously in this division. Craig Mann seems a pretty well-regarded young manager. He did very well there to win that title race with South Shields. That just seemed to be a ding-dong all the way. Yeah. Now, to me, I think it looks very fundamentally on, do they retain Ormerod, who got real goals for them last season, and Luca Thomas is a bright player too, and can they keep growing? Departure-wise, up to now, they don't seem to have suffered anything dramatic. A couple of Cumbrians in that sort of exit group, like Luke Hunter and Liam Brockbank, but they weren't frontline players as such. Corey Whelan is there as the captain. We know all about his sort of reliability as a character and a player too, and one or two sort of arrivals like Cedric Main and Adam Lewis. Will they help them go on again? Remains to be seen, but they seem in a pretty good place from afar, Fylde. And I think if they don't make the playoffs, that might be a push. I think they might give out a bloody nose or two. I think they seem pretty tight operation, and they've got some resources too, as we know, down there as well. So yeah, I think Fylde in the mid-table bunch would be I would say is the most likely prediction we could make. One or two others in that group where again we differ a little bit. Altrincham have been in that, they're always traditionally competitive at this level. The bookies don't really like their chances this year. That they've got them among the longest odds, which by default means that they fancy them for relegation. Not too sure about that. They've got in Christian Dennis. Now, can he have a little Indian summer and get 1 or 2 goals? I suspect he probably will. I don't think he's going to get you 20 odd anymore, but he knows his way around, and he'll be a canny operator if he stays fit. They've lost 1 or 2 of the better players. That's maybe the red flag, the likes of Golden, who went to Boreham Wood, and Crankshaw, who's gone off to Barrow. Jimmy Knowles is still there, I think, and 1 or 2 others. So they smack to me of a bang in the middle of the table sort of side that might lean backwards, possibly. Can't see them going much further forwards, really. So that's Altrincham for me. And 1 or 2 others. Last season, I thought Halifax might underwhelm. They didn't really. They were on the tails of the playoff race for the most part, and they were above most of that mid-table pack. I fear for them in terms of the losses they've had with Harris, with Turner Cook, and Hamami's now gone to Harrogate. Have they replaced players of that calibre sufficiently? That seems to be a big question. They've lost a manager, Lakeland, to Morecambe too, and John McGrath's come in from Buxton, who did a pretty good job there. But do they look like the package that can go on from mid-table higher? I'm not convinced that they do. They're a good club at this level again, but they just seem short of saying, I can see them 6th or 7th. I really can't. Other than that, in the mid-table pack, Tamworth, you had as strugglers. I've got them a little bit higher. That they were 11th last season. They do have nuisance value in the league on that sort of aging artificial pitch.
It's not a brilliant pitch, is it?
Well, no, it's not, and it caught Carlisle sort of out last season among 1 or 2 others. Decent home record. That seems to be the bedrock of their kind of campaigns. They've had an American takeover too, and we know that doesn't guarantee anything as such. But 1 or 2 signings like Tom Parks will add them a little bit of know-how, I suppose. Ex-Carlisle defender. They brought in Ricardo Calder from Brackley, who I thought really impressed against Carlisle last season in the away game. Whether he did greatly for the rest of the season, I don't know, but he looked decent. And they've got real continuity with the manager in Peaks. So they might have to play the loan market well, like they did last season with Lynch, who's moved on to the EFL this year. That might apply to more than just Tamworth, I think. But I see them in the middle and being solid and tricky operators again. 1 or 2 others that I think might just rise up a little bit from the struggle. Sutton United, again, busy summer, a lot of turnover. 1 or 2 interesting signings. Also, Derby has been a very good player at EFL level. He's had 1 or 2 sort of injury hurdles. Maybe a fresh start. Will he go either way there? Babalola, the big striker that Savage took to Forest Green for a short time last season. Experience in Moore Taylor from Forest Green. So there's 1 or 2 there who they're banking on, maybe reviving a bit of their past, I suppose, and being strong enough for Sutton. They never really took off at all last season after a pretty poor start. So I see them maybe lower mid-table, maybe no higher, but I don't quite see them struggling. I think, on personnel, they look like they have enough not to get totally sucked into that real bottom end of things. And a couple more on my list briefly in mid-table. I've got Wealdstone now. Again, one of the strugglers, if you believe the bookies. I think they were in your bottom end group, and I understand that. I just feel that Gary Waddock seemed to pick them up a bit last season. They started off flying, didn't they, under the previous manager, and then they just sort of tailed off, which was probably expected. But just 1 or 2 games as they went along towards the business end of things under Waddock, they put 7 past Hartlepool that night, didn't they? They got the FA Trophy final. So perhaps Waddock has hit upon something there that he can maybe just grow something a little bit stronger and sturdier. They've, as ever, we say this about a lot, they've lost 1 or 2 what seem to be key players. They've added 1 or 2, Jaden Harris has gone in, ex-Carlisle from Sutton. So I think Waddock's sort of wiles as a pretty experienced customer in the dugout will be key there. Mika Obiero, an ex-Carlisle loanee, seems pretty fundamental there too. He's having a pretty good time of it there, I think. So, I've got them as mid-table contenders. I think. I can't see them going much higher, but they might be troublesome for one or two. And lastly, in this group, I've got Worthing, our opponents on Saturday. Now, Rob Elliot feels they'll be top 10 minimum. Is that a reach? I don't know. I don't think you should underestimate them for all the factors we've talked about before. So we needn't sort of repeat ourselves there. But if what they've done to try and build on what they did last year, personnel-wise, and if the sort of Hinchelwood way can continue being as consistent as I guess it has, then they can come up and acclimatise. I feel it'll be some effort if they were to go and really threaten the promotion race, but we have seen it done before. I don't think it's completely out of the question. When we talk about what Boreham Wood did last season, I don't think many of us quite appreciated some of the individual quality they had too, with the likes of Abdul Malik and Brunt, etc., being quite as good as they were at this level. So this will apply to Worthing and others coming up. If they've got a bit of X factor in there as well, along with their methods and their winning sort of styles, well, one or two of them could ruffle some feathers, and that might be Worthing potentially. They could be ones like Fylde that maybe have the potential to leap categories, if you like, from what we're talking about.
Yeah. So moving on to playoff contenders in the business end of the table now. I'll start with Halifax with an asterisk, because I was flip-flopping between them and Fylde sitting in this position. Losing Will Harris is definitely a big loss. I think that may condemn them to mid-table. But the other sides I've got in is Worthing, like we've mentioned. I think the Hinchelwood factors, I think, is vital. And like you just mentioned there, if they do have one or two Mavericks in the team, I think that'll really propel them forward. I've got Harrogate up in the playoff contenders as well. I think they've been a bit low-key this summer. I think they've got a decent squad. I don't think they'll be challenging for the title, to be honest. But I think they'd give one or two teams some trouble further ahead of them. I've also got Barrow. It's an aggressive rebuild with Adam Murray, and I think it'll take time to click. I also feel, like we've mentioned, the momentum for turning around that absolutely dire season last year. I think the recruitment's good, but I don't think it's enough to get them into challenging for the title. I've dropped Forest Green down into playoff contenders rather than title challengers purely because of the players they've lost. I think Laurent Mendy leaving is a big hit for them. And I think Harvey Bunker, I think he could, that loss for them could trouble them. I know he wasn't a starter for them week in, week out, but he was something different in the midfield. It was more combative than the flashy players that I think Robbie Savage likes to have. And finally, I've got Scunthorpe in playoff contenders as well. I think they've made some good signings, and I think they're always a tricky away game, and I think they'll give some teams trouble as well.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with a lot of that, Matty, definitely, with a couple of differences. And I've got a couple of clubs on that borderline of playoff contenders to title candidates, and Forest Green and Southend possibly are where I'm just wavering a little bit. But to go through some of them, Barrow, I think Adam Murray looks to be a pretty sound appointment for this level, I think, and certainly in light of the shambles that it appeared was going on there in terms of all the millions of managers they went through last season. And it was just if you were authoring a pretty season of disarray, that's what you would do, isn't it? What was going on at Barrow last season in that department. But Murray's been pretty good at this level and the levels below as well. His last couple of jobs at Eastbourne and Kidderminster, he's done well at. I think the question there is, like it is with many teams who come down, it's how heavy is the hangover from an especially dreadful season and that downward momentum, and can you sort that out overnight, if you like. I think Murray will make them hardened again, maybe quite pragmatic from what I gather this summer, and that might be a sensible way to kind of adjust to the hard realities of the National League rather than trying to reinvent the wheel in terms of that first season back down. So for that reason, I think they'll be solid enough. One or two of the signings like Crankshaw and Alex Reid, good National League players. Are they title winning signings? Are they promotion signings? I think you can question that. They've lost one or two people like the goalkeeper Stanway, haven't they, too? And the evergreen Sam Foley has sort of finally moved on. But I think the Adam Murray factor and maybe a change of the tone then will make them competitive at the very least. And I think they'll be at the upper end of things rather than carry on falling, if you like. Harrogate, I suspect, may be similar. Doesn't look a side bursting with goals on the surface. And they obviously had their issues in terms of that relegation too. They've added a bit of experience with Tom Lees. If they get a full season out of him, he could be a bit of a linchpin at the level. They've signed Hamami, today as we speak from Halifax too. So there's a bit of extra sort of zest there at the other end of things. And I guess it's, is Simon Weaver's longevity going to be a help or a hindrance now after a relegation? He's been there for so long. He's just about the longest serving manager in the game, I think. And that's been a huge part of their identity for so long. It was last season he was starting to cop for some real criticism as they were sliding to relegation. Given the family ownership of that club, he's one of the last people you'd expect to get the sack after a relegation, and that clearly hasn't happened. It's just can the consequences of relegation, can they be managed quickly enough? They look like they should be able to handle themselves with what they have. I don't see them being a real season-long contender. I might be wrong, but they just don't have the whiff of that to me, to Harrogate. Scunthorpe, another one who a little bit go under the radar in terms of praise for last season because of how well Boreham Wood did as a newly promoted side. But Scunthorpe were right in there for a heck of a lot of that season, and Andy he's clearly done a very good job there. That there's that stability and continuity there in terms of him. There seems a pretty good vibe around there generally from afar. The key questions are, as regards the loss of particularly Callum Roberts, who was a real game changer at this level last season, one of the better ones in the whole division actually. He's gone up to Notts County, and maybe to a slightly lesser extent, Ollie Ewing, that's gone on to Forest Green too, a good midfield operator at this level too. Now, going back to Roberts, you imagine Carlisle losing Regan Linney all of a sudden, and how concerned you would be about what that would take out of your side, whatever else you try and put back in. So, they've signed likes of Kyle Hurst. Is he going to have the same level of impact as Roberts necessarily? One or two other, what you'd say a good solid signings like Ogle, the fullback's gone back there from Oldham. Callum Howe at the back from York. You think these should be solid signings that should fit into what Butler's been building there. Hugh Parker's just about to go there as well. Actually, it was on loan at Carlisle last season. Now, I can't imagine they'll be pinning all their goal scoring hopes on him. He might be to supplement things. To me, that their task is to show that they've not been significantly and unduly weakened by the departures. That's a question that, if they can answer that convincingly, they can perhaps go the distance again. If not, they may have to battle to emulate what they did last season. Beyond that, you've touched on Boston, and I wanted to touch on them as my sort of playoff wild cards a little bit, really. And I think sometimes you have to look at teams and clubs who were trending the right way in the latter stages of the previous season, and they were certainly one. They were one of the real ones to watch when it came to that arrow going upwards a bit. I mean, Paul Hurst, after Graham Coughlin, he did an excellent job, didn't he? He turned their form and results round quite dramatically. Tom Kersons was a standout player for them. He got Player of the Month at one stage. I expect he'll be a key man for them again. He scored a cracking goal in pre-season against Peterborough, I saw the other week. So they seem to be a side that have got their act together a little bit under Hurst. And then it comes down to the ins and outs and how that balances in terms of what quality they go in with. They lost Frankie Maguire, who was one of the key men. So that that will take some replacing. They've brought in experience like Sir Gavin Holohan, a couple coming from Derby and Rotherham, and maybe a bit of a left field one from Gibraltar, Nicholas Pozzo. That's one of the less orthodox names you might expect to see coming in off the transfer market. So I think they've got Canavan from Barrow as well. I think he's gone in there as well, which will be which will bolster their experience certainly. If Hurst can make things knit again after some of those changes, then they seem to be going broadly in the right direction. So if they get into the race, I wouldn't be completely surprised based on that. And then I've got Yeovil too, as I'm a bit less certain about whether they're going to be in this playoff hunt. A few people seem to be quite liking the look of them with some of the recruitment. I'm not sure they quite warrant that sort of status. That might be a bit of an overplayed hand, I think. But when I look at the rest of the division, I still look at them and think, yeah, they should be mid-table, potentially higher, and maybe could sneak into the race with a fair wind. A lot depends on some of those signings really paying off. They brought in Stephen Walker from Scarborough, who had a good season at National North. Now, he was on trial at Carlisle, I think 3 summers ago. Didn't quite work out there, but he seemed to have found his home at Scarborough, so they've taken a chance on him. If that works, they'll have an extra goal threat. Archie Davis has gone there. Can they keep him fit for the season? Can they maximise what he's capable of as an attacking fullback and mitigate perhaps the lesser defensive side maybe of his game? Sparsov coming in from Southend looks an interesting hunch. Zane Westbrook coming in, Ben Radcliffe's gone in on loan, who Rob Elliott's worked with before. So there looks some potentially promising business done there. And the manager's been in a little while now and kind of had a look at things. They had a bit of early turbulence last season managerially. Yeah. So I can see a run at the playoffs there if they get some good cohesion like one or two of these other teams. I don't see them struggling. It's how good that recruitment turns out to be and how quickly the manager Rowley can make it function positively. So they would be, I think, in the playoff outsiders camp, but certainly not to be ruled out.
And the final category, I think the one that everyone guesses at least one team we've both got in here is the title chasers. So I'll run through mine first. I've got Hartlepool in there. I think they might be contenders for best summer in the league. The signings they've made, I think, are brilliant under Lee Clark. Jack Nolan from Morecambe, I think that's a really good signing. You've got a couple of EFL imports going in as well. At Popov, one to watch, I think. And also, like we mentioned, Will Harris has gone there. I think that's a really good signing. The only thing you could put next to them is, have they made too much change too quickly? The cohesion is definitely one to watch there. Boreham Wood, I think they're one of the favourites for the title. They've gone for keeping the cohort together, which I think was the best port of call. And just aside from where I think they'll play, the rejection of the bid for Abdul Malik, I've seen a lot of people say, your National League, you should take the money. You're not going to get more. But they know how much he's worth, and they know how much he's worth to Boreham Wood especially. They obviously believe he's worth more than $1 million. So they're going to say no, and they're going to keep him. And I think if they keep him, I really think they've got a chance to win the league, definitely. Southend, it's been a very busy summer. I think they've made some good signings. Daley Campbell and Rico Richards I like. And finally, Carlisle United are up there as well. Record points haul last season. Added where we needed to add. I think the only issue I see with Carlisle is the weakness for injuries at the start of the season, but that's at the start of the season. They could very quickly come back in after a good start and propel the Blues on.
Yeah, I think I'm in agreement with most of those that you name. But again, like I said before, there is a pretty looming question over pretty much all of those teams. That's why I think it's so hard to predict. I mean, Hartlepool, you mentioned, I think, for a club with some resources this summer, they've made a couple of what would appear from afar to be the most obvious signings to go for in Nolan and Harris. I mean, Harris, a 20-goal striker at this level who was gettable, would be an obvious one. They've gone and got him. Can he repeat that again now? Has he now sort of found his found his way and found his place at this sort of level after a few years of emerging without such great effect. But it was very effective for Halifax, not so much against Carlisle in the games we saw him last season, but those goals don't happen by accident at this level. And Nolan, a bit like Aziz in a way, was a standout at a nosedive in Morecambe, wasn't he? And he was always going to move on, I think, again. Now, the fact that Nolan had to end up at Morecambe to sort of revive himself, I think, is perhaps the question when it comes to him. It went from Accrington to Gillingham, and it didn't really take off at Gillingham in the way I think a lot of people expected it might. But he showed a lot of his quality last season, and I think there'd have been numerous takers for him at this level, and maybe the one above as well. And Hartlepool have gone and got him now. There's they have their American wealth to sort of deploy, and they're putting quite a bit of that about. And I think what you said is right. Can it coalesce, come together quickly? And is Lee Clark the man to make that happen? Those are big questions, and I don't think there'll be any certainty about that because it's not gradual evolution as such with that squad. When you talk about some of those really significant additions, Jordan Hugel's gone into. Yeah. So someone who's had a very good career at higher up, is he still going to be as effective on the way down? Liam Gibson looks a solid addition. I think again they look like a side that'll be contenders. I'm not sure whether you can hang your hat on them yet to say champions elect. They may turn into that. I'm not sure. In every position yet, you can say they're a title-winning unit, and is Lee Clark a title-winning manager? He's kind of coming back into the frontline English managerial scene now after quite a spell away from it. I know he sort of did quite a respectable job in hard circumstances at Rotherham last season, and Hartlepool went for him quite early, after the back end of last season. So it's unclear, really. I think that the squad will have improved certainly, and there'll be a lot of optimism around, I'm quite sure, but I don't think these things happen overnight necessarily, and it might be progress of stages rather than bang, a few good signings, new manager and champions. So playoffs, though, I would think for Hartlepool, I'll be surprised. It would be a bit of a failure if they don't make the playoffs. I think with what they're doing at the moment. Boreham Wood, I think this applies to them probably more than anyone, but not exclusively them. I think this season is a lot about who some of the better sides keep as much as who they bring in. As we speak, Abdul Malik's still there, as you touch on, and Rush is still there, and Brunt and everything like that. And Danny Hunter, the chairman, seems set on fighting to hold on to players of that caliber. They're turning down those bids, like you said. There'll be a lot of brinkmanship going on, and I'm quite sure the figure that they would sell for. I'd be astonished if there wasn't. And whether it goes that high, who knows? I think you're absolutely right. They're entitled to ask and command whatever they think is worth and whatever they think is value, and whatever they can stomach turning down as a windfall. That's their lookout, essentially, isn't it? If they can keep that mixture alive all the way through the season, well, one, you'd have to say fair play, given the interest in Abdul Malik that seems to be there. And two, if that's the case, they'll be obvious title contenders because of how strong they were last season, because of the Luke Garrard factor that we saw to such impressive effect last season. And he reinforced that with a new contract, didn't he, at the end of the playoffs as well. They've not signed in bulk, which suggests they're looking to sort of add sparingly. Al-Iraqi went in from Rochdale. That looks like a decent in personnel, and they've just signed Cashman, the forward, too. They've lost Ilasanmi, who was a real fine servant, I thought, in defence for them last season. I kind of expected David Ajiboy to really cause him some problems in that playoffs. It didn't really happen, and that was partly a tribute to how Boreham were organised, but also that pretty durable older stager in defence. So, but again, they've not been raided, have they? And they seem to have a lot of the ingredients right now to be real strong challengers. It's all about if they can keep that continuity, and what happens if they can't, and if they have to lose Abdul Malik, and what they do in terms of replacing that. But right now, you have to have them as contenders, I think. And the others, Southend, can't quite make my mind up about them yet, just because there's an unknown quantity aspect with Kieran Dyer going in. They're another club that's sort of twisted rather than stuck managerially. So we really don't know. That could be inspired, or it could go the other way, like a lot of these gambles. They've lost one or two pretty big players, like Scott Morris, who was a real servant for them, and a really good player, dynamic player at this level. Boyes has just gone, hasn't he, to York, and did very well for them with goals on loan last season. So I think they've recruited reasonably well in. You mentioned Richards and Hartigan. I think looks on paper a good solid midfield addition who's got good experience of doing well at this level and going up and higher. So they look well set to be in the mix, and they're a big club for the level, aren't they? They got the biggest attendances last season, just above Carlisle. I'm not looking at them from afar. I'm not convinced about their firepower at the moment, but again, somebody may emerge there. There might be more business to be done, and players can emerge like they did last season that you maybe don't quite recognise straight away. So I'm not sure they're quite looking like champions elect, but who does really? And amongst all of these, there's not many. So I would expect Southend, looking at the makeup of the division, to go certainly higher than they did last year when they just sort of were at the bottom end of the playoffs. They might be at the higher end of it. Champions, not too sure. Forest Green, again, that just comes down to are things ever going to settle for long enough there? Because last is our guide as to that. The churn of players as that went on kind of never ended. It was pretty ridiculous, really. There was no sort of handle on stability of squad there, was there at all? From a side that looked quite promising in parts and were contenders for a large part of it. They just seemed to, I don't know, it just seemed that identity must have been sacrificed along the way there with the amount of change.
Definitely.
And I think that's the key question there. Will Savage allow something to settle and grow for long enough without lurching out into the market for another big idea from the level below or this level or something else, or a new idea, a new striker? What are they going to grow? What are they going to build? They've lost Mendy, haven't they, to Hearts, and got big money for him by all accounts. Knowles has gone as well, and you mentioned Bunker. Now he was a bit of a victim of the churn, I think, last season, really.
Definitely
a pretty solid performer for them early on, but again was one that kind of lost his kind of place there, really. And you look at him on the surface and think, looks like a pretty tidy signing for Carlisle, don't you? So, recruitment wise, Ewing in from Scunthorpe looks a good signing. We saw he was good for Scunny last season, and Amari Patrick's gone in as well. Now we know what he's like when he's hot. We know what he's like when he's cold as well. So they'll have a squad and a team, and certainly resources as well, to be right up there, I'm sure. It's whether they can be stable enough for long enough as to whether they can sustain a title challenge. I've got them in the title challenging category of mine, very much on that borderline, I think, with Southend. I think a lot will have to solidify and stabilise, just as a general way of operating, I think, for them to be cast iron title contenders. And then we come to the small matter of Carlisle United, don't we? Now we've said a lot about Carlisle, so we don't need to repeat ourselves and go over old ground. But Carlisle simply have to be contenders, don't they? Have to be very much firmly in that race. Carlisle haven't lost anyone you'd have been desperate to keep, I don't think. They've addressed or looked to address one or two of those major areas that you think were crying out for it, like that core midfield area, defensive midfield, and slightly creative wise as well. Still think there may be an attacker short, as we've discussed earlier. The questions are, can Rob Elliot and his team and his coaches, etc., translate what they did to Gateshead in different circumstances to what the challenge is here now? Can the change in style is looking to oversee, can that knit quickly enough to at least make a good start that can develop into the sort of formidable run that you're going to need to win the league? These injuries early on, will that impede them to any sort of lasting effect. We hope not, but you have to consider the risk. The Gabe Breeze uncertainty a little bit over his future too, and how that is managed if it comes to a head or not. We know Carlisle are operating with a different tack budget-wise too. So how will that inform any decisions that they have to make a little bit more on the hoof as the season goes on as well? But all in all, Carlisle look that they have the squad and the personnel to be very firmly in the title race. It depends, I suppose, how the additions that they've made will enhance that, you know, and these kind of hunches that they've acted on with someone like Aziz and Bunker and the defenders from Gateshead in Nicholson and Richardson and Duru, who's done well on trial as well, and Mawaki. I mean, we're hoping that these will prove better than what Carlisle have kind of jettisoned in the end, you know, the likes of Thomas and Hayden at the back and things like that. So that's why there are questions over Carlisle. Of course there are. There's very few clubs, I think, and Carlisle are certainly included in this, that you say it's going to be a pretty smooth, obvious evolution and you can just see how it's just going to naturally carry on going upwards. We can't say that of Carlisle yet. We certainly hope that it is, and there are reasons why we can think that it might certainly be like that. I just hope they can be along the way of trying a new style in a new way, which I think is a perfectly fair way to lean. I hope they can still retain some of the things that were on the more effective side of what Mark Hughes did, which were, you know, Carlisle, although yes, they did drop one or two pretty careless points last season, they were still largely ruthless, flat track bullies, if you like, against most of the teams you'd expect them to beat. They didn't trip up against many of the lesser lights, and they also sort of showed a bit of muscle, if you like, in body language and in stature when they come up against the Forest Greens and the Scunthorpes. You know, when things were perhaps a bit more physical, a bit more emotional potentially, Carlisle come out on the right side of those. It was just they were out footballed in the end by the better footballing sides in the division. So it's keeping one end of that and adding the other one. Will make them into champions, and maybe just being, I still think, just on alert maybe to make that maybe one extra impactful signing that they might just need along the way. It doesn't necessarily have to be now. It could be along the way, because we're not governed by the transfer windows in the same way, are we? But I just feel they might need to do something more just to reinforce that aim. But you know, very soon we're going to find out, aren't we?
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us for the third episode of the Blues Notebook. We want to know your predictions for the National League. Who's going to walk the league? Is there going to be a title challenge, or is there one team just destined to go down? From me and John, thank you for joining us, and we'll catch you next week.
Hold on a minute. I've got my trivia question to chuck in right at the end.
Here we go.
And I'm sure everyone's got it right by now. I don't think you were even born when this was going on, so you're forgiven. When did Carlisle last win 2 opening day league games in successive seasons? I hope I'm not going to alarm anyone when I say that it wasn't even in this millennium. The last time it happened was in 1998-99 and 99-2000, which is quite surprising, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
But there you go. That's when it happened. In 98-99, they beat Brighton 1-0 with an Eden Stevens goal. 99-2000, they beat Leyton Orient 2-1 through Richard Tracy and Steve Soley. And ever since then, it's been win, draw, defeat, draw, win, all that sort of thing, without back-to-back opening day wins. So that's hopefully a stat that will be very much put to bed and incinerated on Saturday against Worthing. So hopefully that's not too pessimistic a note to end this podcast on. But we love a good stat, don't we? So there's one, and let's hope we're looking at some really good ones when we talk next week.
Well, hopefully there's a new answer to that trivia question that'll be fresh in the minds of everyone after Saturday. Thank you for joining us. Make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment of anything you want to ask John and I. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.